Welcome to the Quotive Corner. Today's quote comes from a list, which is itself worth mentioning, because knowing where it comes from changes how you hear it. Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric. That's Bertrand Russell, and it's the 7th item in what he called his Liberal Decalogue, a 10-point list he published in the New York Times Magazine on December 16, 1951. Russell was a British philosopher, mathematician, logician, and Nobel laureate, one of the most prolific and controversial public intellectuals of the 20th century. He co-authored the Principia Mathematica, one of the most important works in the history of logic. He was imprisoned during World War I for his pacifism. He campaigned against nuclear weapons into his 90s. He was, by any measure, a man who had spent his entire life thinking thoughts that were initially unwelcome to the people around him and defending them anyway. His Liberal Decalogue was his attempt to distill the principles of intellectual courage and free inquiry into 10 plain instructions. The quote you're hearing is item 7. It's been quoted independently for decades because it stands perfectly well on its own. Now, let's look at what it's actually claiming, because it's more precise than it first sounds. The quote is structured as a reassurance, "Do not fear," which tells you immediately that Russell was aware the thing he was recommending carried a cost. Nobody needs to be told not to fear something painless. Eccentricity of opinion, holding a view that diverges from what the people around you believe, is socially uncomfortable in ways that are real and persistent. It invites skepticism, dismissal, sometimes ridicule. It places you outside the consensus, which is not a comfortable place to be for most people, most of the time. Russell isn't pretending the discomfort doesn't exist. He's saying the discomfort is worth tolerating for a specific reason. That reason is the second half of the quote. Every opinion now accepted was once eccentric. This is a historical claim, and it's a verifiable one. Run the list of ideas that are now considered obviously correct, settled, foundational, beyond reasonable dispute, and trace them back to when they were first proposed, and you will find, reliably, that they were considered strange, dangerous, or absurd by the mainstream of their time. The heliocentric model of the solar system was eccentric. Germ theory was eccentric. The idea that women should have the right to vote was eccentric. The idea that slavery was morally wrong was, in societies that practiced it, considered eccentric by those with the power to define what counted as normal. The idea that the Earth was billions of years old was eccentric. The suggestion that human beings might one day fly was eccentric, and not very long ago. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute a genuine principle. Every idea that is now so thoroughly accepted that questioning it seems odd was once the position of a minority who were willing to hold it before the evidence was conclusive, before the social permission existed, before the consensus had shifted. The consensus didn't form because everyone woke up one morning and agreed simultaneously. It formed because specific people held eccentric positions long enough and argued for them persuasively enough that the mainstream eventually followed. Russell is asking you to understand yourself as potentially being one of those people, not in a grandiose way, but in a practical one. The willingness to hold an unpopular view because the evidence and reasoning support it, even before the social consensus has caught up, is not just a personality quirk of contrarians. It's the mechanism by which intellectual and moral progress actually happens. What makes this harder than it sounds is that you cannot always tell in the moment whether your eccentric opinion is ahead of its time or simply wrong. The history of ideas includes not just the eccentric opinions that turned out to be correct, but also the eccentric opinions that turned out to be embarrassing. Phrenology was once held by serious people as a scientific discipline. Eugenics was once a mainstream intellectual position among people who considered themselves progressive. The confidence of an eccentric opinion in itself tells you nothing about whether it's right. Russell was aware of this, which is why his Liberal Decalogue doesn't just say be eccentric. It says don't fear eccentricity, and it pairs that instruction with others. Be scrupulously truthful even when the truth is inconvenient. Find more pleasure in intelligent dissent than in passive agreement. The eccentricity Russell is endorsing isn't arbitrary contrarianism or the performance of uniqueness. It's the willingness to follow careful reasoning to conclusions that happen to diverge from the consensus, and to hold those conclusions clearly and honestly, even when they're unwelcome. That distinction is important. The eccentric opinion Russell is defending is the one that arrives through genuine inquiry rather than the one that arrives through the desire to be different. Anyone can hold unusual views as a form of identity or rebellion. The kind of intellectual courage Russell is actually describing is quieter and harder than that. It's the willingness to say clearly what you've concluded, even when it's inconvenient, even when the room doesn't agree, even when the social cost of saying it is real. John Stuart Mill made the companion argument when he observed that teachers and learners fall asleep at their post the moment there's no enemy in the field. That unchallenged consensus loses its vitality and becomes something held out of habit rather than understanding. Russell is making the related point from the other direction. The person willing to challenge that consensus, to be the enemy in the field, is performing a service that the consensus itself can't perform. An unchallenged idea doesn't know if it's still right. It just knows it's unchallenged. There is also something worth naming about the specific courage this requires at a personal level. It's relatively easy to hold eccentric opinions privately. It's considerably harder to articulate them in rooms where the consensus runs the other way. To say, carefully and honestly, that you think the conventional wisdom is wrong and here's why, and then to deal with the social discomfort that follows without either backing down prematurely or doubling down defensively. That particular kind of composure, holding your position without rigidity, staying open to counter evidence while not being moved by social pressure alone, is rarer than intellectual eccentricity itself. Now, the honest counterpoint. Not every eccentric opinion is valuable, and not every mainstream opinion is suspect. The existence of many correct eccentric opinions throughout history doesn't mean that eccentricity is itself a signal of correctness. It means the relationship between popularity and truth is weaker than we instinctively assume, in both directions. Widely held beliefs can be wrong, but minority opinions can also simply be wrong. The discipline Russell is pointing toward is not contrarianism for its own sake. It's the willingness to let genuine reasoning lead you somewhere unpopular when it does, which is different from seeking the unpopular position because it feels more interesting or more independent. Russell spent his life doing exactly that, following the reasoning wherever it led, regardless of where it put him socially or politically, and paying the price when the price was real. That's not a comfortable way to move through the world. But the world of ideas looks substantially different today, because people like him were willing to occupy that uncomfortable position. The opinion you hold carefully, honestly, and against the current consensus might be wrong. It might also be what the next generation considers obvious. That's worth knowing before you decide how much the consensus matters. Thanks for spending a few minutes here at the Quotive Corner. If this one made you think of a view you hold but haven't said out loud, or one you've been quietly walking back because the room didn't agree, think about that for a bit. And remember, wisdom isn't in the quote, it's in the reflection. See you in the next episode.